Hello everyone and welcome to the next edition of the webinar series hosted at the Ball State Center for Professional Selling. We are going to continue our conversation with the Senior VP of Business Development at the Divine Group, Darby Fazekas, where in the earlier interview, Darby had shared some insights about what she sees are certain things with millennials, especially in the sales force, based on looking at countless people analytics reports, where you actually taken a look and advised companies on how to deal with millennials, amongst other things as well.
Right.
So Darby, so quickly to make sure that our viewers are up to speed, you mentioned 4 things that are critical when you have to consider with the millennials in the workforce. And of course, sales is also one part of the workforce indeed. One is the fact that they are looking for kind of people who can be accessible, be approachable, and of course give them the right kind of insights, and they can hold them accountable for that too. You talked about the fact that these people work well with the millennials, especially working with expectations, setting up the right kind of expectations, telling them what to do. I mean, giving them suggestions, not explicitly telling them what to do. You also talked about the fact that contrary to what people think, that millennials like to be coached, which I want to really want to pick up on soon. And the last one, which I think was, well, the 3 were positive things. The 4th one was the fact that a lot of millennials need for approval, which could actually deter them in certain sales situations as well. So that's pretty much where we are. So did I miss anything, or was it a good recap of what we discussed?
No, great recap. The number one is that they have very high expectations for their supervisor, manager, leader, yes, and that they do like to have structure in the activity that is required of them. They are coachable, and yes, they do. We're just seeing a trend that they have more need for approval than other populations. But by the way, salespeople as a population tend to have higher need for approval.
Absolutely.
So, you know, I don't know, is this an exponential thing that we're going to be seeing? It could be.
But actually, let's actually, now that you mentioned, let's talk about that, because my expectation has always been that salespeople have a higher need for approval. But is it much more for millennials? Because that could be very, very interesting, because it could lead your millennials to make promises to the customers just to get an approval from the customers that they should not be doing. Is that something that threat that managers should be worried about?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily see those 2 things connected. So there is a certain personality type that tends to overpromise, and that personality type does tend to go into sales. But in addition to that, I'm seeing a lot more of the entire millennial population having a lot more actually, need for approval. And I think that's driven by a few different things. I believe that it is driven by social media. You know, you post something and it's, you know, so many likes and in so many seconds or minutes or whatever. I believe that it's also because we have recognized our kids in all kinds of competition, that you get a medal for, you know, just being in the competition. And so it's this recognition that they have had over the years. And, you know, when it comes right to, we have no room to complain, because we have created this type of personality. We've created kids that they want to be recognized for their work. I remember one of my millennials coming home from the first week at an internship and saying, you know, I'm working so hard. And I said, no one cares how hard you work. They care if you're getting the job done. And so that's just such a huge shift, because what they've been taught for a long time, not that they're not getting grades, but they get a lot of attaboys for, you know, if you do your best, that's all we can ask of you. Well, that's not what it's like out in the business world. You do your best and you still didn't get it done. Too bad. You don't get your bonus, or you're working on the weekend, or whatever that is. And so I think that in some ways we've been sort of unfair in the way that we have. But
it's about setting expectations, right? Because for me, that is what I think is very, very fascinating. So we mix the concept of parenting and sales management coaching at this point in time, because there's a lot of similarities there. For me, the biggest thing is that the need for approval would also mean that, hey, if I set the right kind of expectations, a need for approval might actually be okay, because if the expectations are set right by the right coach.
Yeah.
Because those are the activities that they're supposed to be doing. And if there's a need for approval that is high, then I'm sure it's correlated with a lot with setting the right kind of expectations. Because as you said, if people get rewarded, or the millennials got rewarded for everything that they did right, then it's only fair that the need for approval goes up, which means that the onus or the responsibilities on the sales managers to make sure that they set the right kind of expectations for the kind of activities. And that for me is the concern, again, or maybe it's a concern that I have, maybe it's not relevant at all, is the fact that if you do not have the right kind of sales managers, the tendency is to blame the millennials for mistakes, because there's a higher need for approval. And if the coaching is going to reward you for the outcomes rather than the activities, the need for approval might end up with, if salespeople are already prone to overpromise, the need for approval is just going to push it over the edge in terms of making these promises much more, because they need approval from their supervisors.
So you're saying a lot here. Let's kind of talk about all those details. The first thing, and I agree 100%, although you said it a lot nicer than I'm going to say it, sales managers can whine about not getting the results, with this population, and they can continue to keep doing what's not working, or they can realize that this group is motivated differently, and they can realize that they are the leader or the manager, and that's their job, to lead and manage. I read something a couple of months ago that actually fascinated me. The number one population that is the most unemployed, probably didn't say that right, but the population that is most unemployed, probably a better way to say that, are millennial males. And here's why. Like, you first look at that and you go, oh, these lazy kids. No, it's that this population, they go to work to fund their next adventure. And then they go on their adventure. And then they go to work to fund their next adventure. And they'll probably do that for a number of years until they've, worked through all the adventures. So you can look at that data first, and you can say, oh, well, they're not employed because they're lazy, or they're fill in the blank. But when you know why and understand why, so you can motivate them. So let's go back to what you were saying about the population and how they should be managed. So we have some different parts there. So the first part is there has to be a clear structure of activities, leading indicators. What is it that you need to do? And an expectation of what the conversion rate is for those things, so that they know, so it's not just what I'm doing, but I'm also tracking how well I'm doing it. And so if my conversion rate on the third step in the sales process is not as good as what it should be, that's where I need my coaching, more coaching. Okay, so that's where I need more coaching. So yes, the coaching is very important, but it has to be specific coaching. So now we have another issue. Let's look at what also could go wrong. And that is that you have a manager who is great at giving motivation and attaboys and all that, but they're not giving them specifically for the things that person has to do to be successful. And so here's what I hear. I go on a sales call. I come back to the office, my sales manager said, how did it go? And I said, it went great. And I described all of these great things that I said and did. And I said, and they invited me back. Well, getting invited back is not an outcome for a sales call. Pushing it towards a yes or a no, getting it more qualified, finding out what's their budget, what's their decision-making process. Those are things that I should get high fives for. But getting invited back is not. And so if the sales manager is not listening for specific things, then they can end up encouraging getting invited back. Absolutely. And now they're growing a professional visitor.
So, which is very, for me, essentially what you're saying is this need for approval is, for me, what I hear is that it could also, if you don't have the right manager, I'm still concerned about overpromising, but now what you're saying is there's another factor that you need to keep in mind, is that you could be encouraging the right kind of, the wrong kind of
Right,
things.
behavior.
So which is actually a lose-lose, as you've talked of win-win, this is a lose-lose. So you could have people making promises they cannot keep because their managers have not set the right kind of expectations. And then they start patting them on the back for doing the wrong thing. So essentially you have one way to overpromise, the other way to not necessarily reward them for the right things. So I'm seeing it like this rather than converging. I'm looking at a fact where millennials might actually be a little bit more kind of disenfranchised, mostly because the managers
don't know what they're doing.
Exactly.
Let's just, the
Absolutely.
bottom line is that they're not taking the time and energy and to continue to educate themselves on here's what they need. And so, the other thing that we see in sales management and leadership is that a sales manager or leader will say, I talked to Joe, he understood, and then I talked to Chris and Pat, and they're not getting it. I mean, it's not me. And again, what they are not taking responsibility for as the leader is that it is your job as the leader to be communicating so that other people can understand. So as a leader, I might say, hey, you know what? I run a stroke-free environment. You want a stroke, you get to cash your paycheck, and Monday you get to come back to your job. And so, that's fun, right? But not everybody really is going to thrive in that type of an atmosphere. And so to kind of summarize what we're saying is you have to have the activities. You have to set the expectations towards those activities. And I want to mention something on that in a moment. You have to come back and inspect those activities. I would say initially you do that daily, and eventually you might do that weekly. And you keep inspecting those activities on a weekly basis, because if you don't inspect the activities, it's your kid comes downstairs and says, Dad, I'm going outside to hang out with my kids, and you say, is your room clean? You're inspecting, and they say, yes, it is, and you walk upstairs and it's not clean. Did you do all of your sales activities last week? Yes, I did. Let me see. Let me see. You have to inspect. And part of that, by the way, they like that, because then you can look at it and go, wow, you were supposed to make 300 sales calls and you made 325. Nice going. And I see that your conversion rate here is good. Way to go. And here's our area for improvement or coaching.
Again, I think from what I hear you say, I'm more and more convinced that it always, if you have to deal with millennials, it's great. There is always going to be good things, and there's always going to be difficult things. But if your sales management and leadership is not up to speed,
right,
you're always going to have that. And that's what I've been hammering across all the time, saying organizations spend a lot of money in getting the right kind of young people into the organization, but they forget that they also have to bring their sales managers up to speed.
Right.
Because otherwise you're going to spend a lot of money bringing those millennials in, and you don't get them engaged, and then they're out of the door.
Right.
And I want to touch upon something which I think is very, very interesting, because as a manager, I would definitely not like the idea that a millennial comes in, works for a couple of years, and then funds the next adventure and goes somewhere else, because I'm investing a lot of my time and effort into that particular individual. Mm-hmm. Let's say they do all the things that you said, right? So they set the right expectations, they go back, they check that, they pat them on the back in terms if they've done the right things. Mm-hmm. Right? And I do it all the time. I spend a lot of time doing that, and then 2 years later, that millennial has gone somewhere else. Now I have to spend more time looking for somebody in. Luckily, the Divine Group will help them through that process. Right. But the whole aspect is then I have to go back and reinvest everything and my time again. So what would your recommendations be for managers to make that adventure within the same organization? Mm-hmm. Do you have some, am I making sense? That is,
yeah, there are some organizations that will say, unlimited time off. Yeah. And so maybe that's something that if they're looking to fund an adventure and they want to be gone for a month or 2 months, whatever that is. But it all comes down to expectations. And so understanding what it is that motivates anybody in your workforce. And if it is that somebody wants to, fund an adventure and then spend 6 weeks or 8 weeks or how many weeks that is, depending on how well they can stop and then pick back up, important there. But the other part of that, and here is, you know, when I look at the employee life cycle, so the life cycle is hiring, onboarding, development, management and team building, and succession planning or advancement, and then back to the onboarding. The part here that is just horribly ignored is onboarding. Most companies have such a horrible onboarding process, and if they had a better onboarding process, they would have outlined, here's what you need to do the first 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And so onboarding and re-onboarding somebody who, you know, was gone on an adventure would not be as painful as it is right now.
Indeed. Let me not challenge you, let me play the devil's advocate on that one. Right? The first thing is, when you have that, and none of us are going to be lucky enough to say we have a complete set of salespeople or business developers who are all millennials. So I have one set of rules for my millennials and saying I'm going to come up and I'm going to let you pick up where you left off. Now, how do you kind of balance that with the people who are not millennials? Again, anytime I talk of millennials and non-millennials, I am generalizing, I understand that.
Right.
But how would you try and make sure that you're still fair to all the other people who are going through the whole process without necessarily taking a break or never done it? So this is pretty much for organizations that have a mix of millennials and non-millennials. So what would your recommendation be for that? And following in that is, let's say I have a millennial who's brought in a customer and then decides to take a break. But that customer has come to build a relationship. They have invested in that particular millennial, right? And they don't want to take the time to get another person on board and say, hey, you're not going to onboard the other person on my dime.
Right.
So what is your advice to that? The first one is the other employees who are not millennials, and to customers about setting the expectations right for the customers, because they don't want to go on building relationships again and again. So what would your advice be?
Yeah, so a couple things. The population tends to be pretty collaborative. And so first of all, I would never, ever, ever, ever recommend that a client has one point of contact. I mean, you never want to do that. And so they would have their salesperson as a contact. Now, sometimes in some organizations, the salesperson is also the implementer. In other organizations, the salesperson is not the implementer. So usually there's some sort of team. In our organization, we have communal inboxes. And so there are a few different inboxes for the whole team. And that way, if I'm on vacation, somebody's not sending something to me, or if I'm out on site, they send it to the inbox, and we have one person that's air traffic control. So that's a possibility. When it comes to sales, I mean, sales is a commission type of thing. So you work, you get paid. You don't work, you don't get paid. But you know, not all companies can do that. Not all companies can do that funded adventure, come in, come out. So my advice would actually be more towards the person who wants to do that, to get into a career, a job that you can step in and out of. And so you might be a BDR, a business development rep, where you're getting things into the funnel, and so you can leave and come back more easily. That would have some more flexibility.
It's absolutely fascinating, because what you're talking about has repercussions both for the organization,
right,
as well as for the individual as well, because the individuals need to make sure that the kind of organization they go and work for can help them in this kind of lifestyle that they would like to have. But I really think that the sales managers also need to understand this a lot more and make sure that they recruit the right kind of people in, and make sure that they are aware of how to keep them motivated. But the communal part, which is what I think is fascinating, that it's actually moving up the chain, because this concept of the communal inbox idea that you gave calls for a kind of a customer-centric organization, which actually works on team-based, where you put the customer at the central point, and then we can start having these communal, because this goes beyond just managing millennials.
Right.
This goes into managing customers, which is very, very fascinating, because we have done some research where we look at the concept of silo busting. How do you bust silos? And the concept of getting collaborative communication is the most difficult. especially considering the fact that everybody have their own set of KPIs. And again, I think a fascinating topic to talk about at a later point in time would also be to understand how do millennials in sales interact with millennials in supply chain, millennials in other aspects, because they are going to have different expectations, they're going to have different KPIs, and trying to bring them all together while keeping them motivated, I think, is going to be very, very fascinating. So, Darby, I know that we can talk about a lot of things. So what would your advice be to sales managers, given all that you talked about in terms of the big trends with millennials? What would be your advice be for sales managers?
Well, you know, shameless self-promotion.
Yes.
My very first thing would be assess them.
Yeah.
Assess them so that you can see what you're getting. And if you know that you typically are running a stroke-free environment, you have to make sure that you're not hiring somebody who has this, you know, this high need for approval. You know, maybe a more moderate need for approval or a low need for approval. So my first thing would say assess them. There are certain things that in order to be successful in sales, you have to have. You just have to have. But something that I will share, I haven't shared, this is, I may even be saving the best for last here.
There you go.
Something that I have noticed with this population, which makes them perfect for sales. And that is because of the way they were raised, with kind of a blurred line between them and authority. So when I was growing up, it was Mr. and Mrs. Foster and Mrs. and Mrs. DeVolio. All my parents' friends were Mr. and Mrs. You know, the people who were older at church were Mr. and Mrs. And that's not the way that it is anymore. You know, my kids' friends call me by my first name. So there's this blurred line with authority. And what I have noticed is that this population has no problem calling to the top. They have no problem, you know, so there's something called equal business stature. Yeah. And so if I'm a salesperson that's my age, sometimes I feel like, you know, I shouldn't really be calling on the CEO because I've never been a CEO, and so maybe I just call on somebody that's my level in the organization. This population doesn't have that. The concept of equal business stature. And so, you know, you have these 20 and 22-year-olds out there, you know, I want to talk to the CEO. And they're like, no, you need to talk to purchasing. Like, can purchasing sign the contract? Well, no, that's the CEO. Then I need to talk to the CEO. I mean, they're better than that. But it's fascinating, and it's fabulous. It's fabulous.
Indeed. So if we go back, so assessment, and that's one of the nice things. And then I guess, let me try and put myself in your shoes and say, okay, assessment is something great, but once you bring them on board, I guess onboarding is next, because I think that is going to be critical, because from what I heard you say is that when you fail to onboard them, telling them this is what we expect from you going forward, this is what we have, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, you need to be doing these things, and if you do these things, this is going to be the potential follow-up to that. And if you do it well, we'll follow up with you on that. If you do it great, you progress. So is that something that...
Yes. So let me just add to that. So every sales organization should have at least a 90-day onboarding process. But as the manager, as you are onboarding this person, consider their assessment. Consider what it is. You know, there isn't a perfect salesperson. Some are going to be better at some things than others. And so when you're onboarding somebody who is a high energy person, don't sit them in the corner with the sales books to read, right? So you have to consider their learning style. And again, what are the things, are they somebody who is great at addresses conflict, but they're not that great at questioning and qualifying? So take that 90-day onboarding process and consider the individual.
Indeed, that's great. So once I do that, based on that consideration, then I set the right kind of expectations about what is expected of them, including areas to improve. I guess that's also one of the things that you could work on, and that's the coaching part, right?
Yes.
The coaching part comes in saying, you've onboarded them, but now you make sure that you're consistent in your coaching, and make sure that there's coaching that's got to do with how they kind of portray themselves out there, how are they successful in their job, doing their activities. And the last but not the least is, it goes back to tying the loop, is in need for approval, try to make sure that, again, you've assessed the right kind of people, and based on the need for approval, you're able to treat them differently and look at different things to make sure that they do not feel that the need for approval puts a lot of burden on them, because I can easily imagine that if my boss is going to say, well, you have so many LinkedIn posts, then I'm going to bust my brain to try and come up with enough LinkedIn posts to get so much likes that it would actually stress me out.
Right.
So this need for approval is something that has to be managed very well as well. So essentially, that is pretty much what I think is very, very interesting. So again, Darby, thank you so much for your time. And once again, this interview is going to be made available. There are 2 parts to the interview. Stay tuned for everything. And the information for Ms. Darby Fazekas will also be made available in case you need to contact her as well. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
And stay tuned in for the next webinar.